welcome. Let's get started. So we're finishing off Acts chapter 19 here today. So it's verses 28 down to the end, verse 41. And it follows on, of course, from what we looked at in the previous lesson, verses 21 to 27, with this riot in Ephesus. And this is where Luke essentially gives the account of the riot itself. So I'll read the passage and then we'll go from there.
What is it, sorry?
So Acts chapter 19 and then verses 19 and then verses 28 to 41 to the end of the chapter. So where are we? Here we go. Okay. Acts chapter 19 verses 28 to 41. When they heard this and were filled with rage, they began crying out, saying, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." And the city was filled with confusion, and they rushed with one accord into the theatre, dragging along Gaius and Aristarchus, Paul's travelling companions from Macedonia. And when Paul wanted to go into the assembly, the disciples would not let him. Also, some of the Asiarchs, who were friends of his, sent to him and repeatedly urged him not to venture into the theatre. So then, some were shouting one thing and some another, for the meeting was in confusion and the majority did not know for what reason they had actually come. And together, some of the crowd concluded that it was Alexander, since the Jews had put him forward, and having motioned with his hand, Alexander was intended to make a defence to the assembly. But when they recognized that he was a Jew, a single cry arose from them all, as they shouted for about 2 hours, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." Now after calming the crowd, the city clerk said, "Men of Ephesus, what man is there after all who does not know that the city of the Ephesians is guardian of the temple of the great Artemis and of the image which fell down from heaven? So, since these are undeniable facts, you ought to keep calm and do nothing rash. For you have brought these men here, who are neither robbers of temples nor blasphemers of our goddess. So then, if Demetrius and the craftsmen who are with him have complaint against anyone, the courts are in session and proconsuls are available. Let them bring charges against one another. But if you want anything beyond this, it shall be settled in the lawful meeting. For indeed we are in danger of being accused of a riot in connection with today's events, since there is no cause for which we can give as an account for this disorderly gathering." After saying this, he dismissed the meeting. Let's pray. Blessed Lord, who caused all holy scriptures to be written for our learning, grant us so to hear them, to read them, to mark them, to learn them, and to inwardly digest them, in order that we may embrace and ever hold fast to the blessed hope in Jesus Christ. Amen. So, as I mentioned in the introduction, this concludes this chapter, and it's Luke's accounting of, his summary accounting of the events, riotous as they were here in Ephesus. What we had last week, just to refresh your memory briefly, was Paul in Ephesus itself, him also mentioning about having, finishing his journey and then going to Rome and so on and so forth. But then this great disturbance breaking out because of a man named Demetrius, who was a local silversmith and probably actually one of the leaders of the silversmith guild in Ephesus itself. And he meets or convenes with not just the silversmiths, but many of the workers and other such craftsmen particularly, in order to talk about what this Paul has done to them or for them or against them. The way in which, how, as he says in verse, if you look there at verse 27, and not only is there, verse 26 I should say, 26. "And you see and hear that not only in Ephesus, but in almost all of Asia, this Paul has persuaded and turned away a considerable crowd, saying that things made with hands are not gods." And we explained in last week's lesson that the effect that the gospel was now having and the Christian religion was now having on the people there was impacting all the way down to their economics and everything else, the politics and other such things. So in verse 28 is where we pick up. When they heard this and were filled with rage, they began crying out, saying, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." This, we have to assume, is essentially well, it fits with what we know about Ephesus, but this is essentially how would you say, a motto, a war cry, a rallying cry. Great is Artemis of the Ephesians, that obviously was used and well known in Ephesus at this time.
Yeah, a chant.
A chant, yeah, exactly.
Like in all, that you see in all the...
sports and whatnot.
Oh no, I'm thinking the word's coming to me in a minute, where you're objecting to something as a crowd.
Sure, in rallies and protests and other sorts of things. Yes,
that's the word I'm trying to think of. It's a protest chant.
Yes. Exactly. And so great is, and it features a couple of times here in this passage, right? Great is Artemis of the Ephesians. That, as we explained last week, Ephesus is the heartland. It's the seat of the Artemisian cult, and Artemis is the patron goddess of Ephesus, as Athena was the patron goddess of Athens, obviously, as the name suggests, and so on and so forth. And they're in a rage, right?
So there's Romans around at this time, it's under Roman rule.
Oh, yeah, absolutely, yeah.
And it's got, so I should imagine soldiers just standing around looking at this and going...
Yep, there'll be Roman soldiers all here and whatnot, and part of the political element is very much featuring in this story. So verse 29, the city was filled with confusion, and they rushed with one accord into the theatre. In other words, they rushed together to the theatre, the main theatre there in Ephesus, which was quite sizable, dragging along Gaius and Aristarchus, Paul's travelling companions from Macedonia. The city being filled with confusion, I want to look up the word there. Yeah, synchikeseos, with confusion, with great disturbance. It's only used once here in the scriptures, but I'm familiar with it from other Greek literature. This is a chaotic scene. It's a loosely organised thing, very loosely organised, which is why by the time you get to the end of the text, the city clerk, basically essentially the mayor of the city, functionally is what that role is. He tells them he eventually calms them down because the Romans might charge us with a riot. It's chaotic. The scene you should be envisioning is masses of thousands and thousands and thousands of people, potentially even, well, probably actually not potentially, probably tens of thousands of people, all throughout the city, making their way towards the theatre. Obviously, this centre of public life and speaking and other such things, where assembly would meet, where the ecclesia, the assembly, would meet in the theatre. There's confusion, there's chaos, they're rushing towards the theatre. Was
it like a big theatre, like the Colosseum, or...?
Oh, certainly not, no. I mean, the Colosseum's kind of incomparable to anything else in the ancient world, but the Ephesian amphitheatre would be 10 to 15,000, I would think.
So it's pretty big, yeah. When you're talking about event forums.
Yeah, Ephesian...
I was just wondering if they were all sort of like people standing out the gates and all that.
And there would have been overflow and whatnot. I can see if I can look it up in a couple.
No. I was just getting a ballpark of how big it was and how crowded it would have been.
Yeah, it's very big, very big. And my numbers might even be underestimating. If I said 10 to 15,000, it could be much more. It's very, very, very big. 25,000.
Whew. Yeah. Some football stadiums that wouldn't reach that high.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, what's bigger than basically any indoor arena for like indoor sports like basketball or something like that. Yeah. And the amphitheatres, keep in mind, so they're semicircles in other words.
Yeah.
25,000. I said 10 to 15, but yeah, no, it's much bigger, more than that, about 25. It's very big for anyone. Has anyone here been to Ephesus before? No. Oh, yes, you have. Okay. Yeah, very. Yes.
I knew what I was looking at back.
Yeah, very big. And the thing with ancient Greek theatres or amphitheatres, is that they're designed in a very clever way, kind of architecturally, where the sound carries a shockingly far distance with the way that the steps are actually levelled and carved. You can stand on one side of the theatre and hear someone speaking at room indoor kind of voice, way up, just because the way that the actual acoustics work.
So you wouldn't want to say, gee, this actor's pretty bad, isn't it?
No, yeah, exactly, no. And I should try and, after we've finished, you can find videos online, I'll find a video and I'll show you what I'm talking about, where you can stand on one side and the other person is way away, and anyone who's not actually sitting in the seat can't hear because they're too far away. But then when you actually put your head down, where people would be sitting, you can hear someone speaking in a normal voice like I'm speaking right now before they even start elevating their voice. Yeah, it's a natural acoustic that didn't amplification technology. Very clever stuff. But anyway, they're in the theatre, so they rush there, and they drag with them, as it says there in verse 29, Gaius and Aristarchus.
How did they find them? I mean, surely they must have been near where Paul was, but they didn't get him.
Yeah, they obviously were. Well, we don't know how they got a hold of them, but they got a hold of them one way or the other.
Yeah.
They might have been in the marketplace. They could have been somewhere public. Who knows? We don't know how they got them.
No, I just mean that they got them, but not Paul or any of the other ones. I mean,
correct. They obviously weren't with Paul at the time physically. They must have been somewhere else.
Maybe they just said, "Oh, there's a couple of Greeks."
Could have been. They obviously had identified. They'd obviously identified. Well, I take it. I suspect, and this is where. So yes, Greek names, but I suspect that these guys are actually diaspora Jews, so ethnically Jewish Christians.
Okay.
And my reasoning for that will come up when we get about halfway through. So verse 30, and when Paul wanted to go to the assembly, the disciples would not let him. Also, some of the Asiarchs. So Asia East, or the province of Asia, which is where Ephesus is. Archons, which is just archos is just the Greek word for ruler. So, an archon was a pretty high-ranking ruler in Greco-Roman culture. So the Asiarchs were the rulers of Asia. So
they were heavy hitters.
Yeah, very powerful guys.
Yeah.
In pretty high levels of public office. But they were friends with Paul. Now, friends could either be meaning friends who are investigating the Christian religion, perhaps it could have been, or they could actually be Christian already. The sentence, Luke's mentioning of them here is not really about them. It's really about the point, as you can see in verses 30 and 31. His point's not really about who the Asiarchs are or what's been going on with them. But it's really about even the Asiarchs were telling Paul, no, don't go there. That's the main point. But still, though, it is worth noting that the Asiarchs, or the Archons of Asia, the rulers of Asia, some of them at least, were friends with Paul, which means that most likely some of them have potentially already converted to Christianity.
Or they just saw that it could be a total dumpster fire and said, "No, you better not go."
Yeah, exactly. Or they were friendly with Paul because Paul's a Roman citizen.
Yes.
And therefore they're giving him some helpful advice. Yeah. Repeatedly urging him not to venture into literally to give himself up to the crowd in the theatre. He wanted to do it in order to. He's potentially thinking, well, they're going to kill Gaius and Aristarchus in this mob, in this riot, and so he's wanting to give himself up in exchange for them, right? So very honourable, very noble. They urge him, no, don't do that. And there's an interesting point to be made there. There's no shortage of times throughout history where. Well, we do it today all the time, and rightly so. The leader of a group needs to be protected, right? The guy who's leading, and this could go in a political setting, this could go in a military setting, in this kind of case, it's a kind of, I don't know, religious cultural setting, whatever you like to call it, socio-cultural setting. But Paul is their leader. Paul is the one who these kinds of disciples and friends that are being referenced here are disciples and friends because Paul has ministered to them, because Paul has preached to them, so on and so forth, right? Whether Paul liked it or not, Paul needed to be protected, right? Because this thing is not done with Paul alone, right? He's got Gaius and Aristarchus and others. Timothy and whatnot have been up in Macedonia. Mentioned up in verse 22, for example. Timothy's also now down, obviously, here in Ephesus as well. He becomes the first kind of presbyter and then bishop, essentially, of Ephesus. But Paul needs to be protected. Paul's the leader of this. Paul is the guy who is kind of leading the charge, quote unquote. And that's just the way that human beings operate. There's always a leader or a group of leaders. And few are leaders and most are followers, and that's just perfectly fine.
Well, we do it today. The US offered the Ukraine president, do you want to be evacuated? Yeah,
exactly. You've got to protect. Exactly. And any kind of, there's all kinds of, the leaders needs to be protected. When our troops were in most parts of the Middle East, for example, in the last 20 years, especially in places like Afghanistan, where it's much more difficult to distinguish between civilian and enemy combatant, when you're in country, you don't salute the team leader. Because if a bunch of guys, if someone's rocking up on base, and Taliban or Al Qaeda have scouts who are watching the base, and a bunch of guys stand at attention and are saluting as we would, or for them it's here, but
sniper target.
Then who do you think that guy is?
Yeah.
That's not the janitor.
Well, that's how they're getting the senior Russians as well, because
correct, because they're more easily identifiable. They haven't done a terribly good job of concealing themselves yet. And so you protect the leader. That's just how it goes. And so here, protecting Paul is of paramount importance, even if, not that it turns out that way, it works out fine, but even if Gaius and Aristarchus were unfortunately just mobbed to death, essentially. Not a good way to go. But if that resulted in Paul remaining protected, that's a worthy sacrifice, right? It's something that's an honourable and noble thing. And it doesn't turn out that way, so it works out well. But if that had been the case, then that would be a worthy sacrifice, because it's also a blunt reality that in terms of who's moving the proverbial needle more, it's Paul, not Aristarchus and Gaius. Not because they don't matter, not because their lives are unimportant, not because their death is something that should be treated. No, none of those things. But about worthy sacrifice, right? And I would be willing to bet large sums of money that if we were able to somehow get in the heads of Gaius and Aristarchus here, not that Luke is doing that, they're not the ones in focus, I'd make a sizable wager that Gaius and Aristarchus would not want Paul to come. Do you understand what I'm saying? They would, if they got given a choice, they would say, no, go away, no, stay back, right? I think that's a rational conclusion, that they themselves would be willing to sacrifice their lives if it kept Paul safe. Luke was only there on that second journey. Luke's not here at this time. He then gets this information through his historical work. He was there in Macedonia and other such places back in a couple of chapters earlier, kind of chapter 16 onward, on the second journey of Paul, when they arrived in Troas and crossed over the Aegean Sea. Luke was with them. Lands in Macedonia. He's with them on that second journey, but he's not here with them. The pronoun, that's the way we knew that, because Luke switched in those passages to the first person, and he was actually giving his own account of it. But here it's when they heard this, they were filled and blah blah.
So it's still third person.
It's still, he's gone back to third person for quite a while now. He's not on this journey. And so there have been a number of instances like that in the history of the church. Every single one of you who have an English translation in front of you, which we all do, we can thank a series of events and processes that came about from this exact same principle. There are a number of people who translated the scriptures into English, but the defining man who did that was a guy called William Tyndale in the 16th century, so 1500s. He translates the New Testament in, I believe, 1536 off memory, and actually, sorry, no, he translated the Old Testament and most of the New Testament. He is unfortunately executed before he finishes the New Testament.
That was the King James Version, was it?
No, the King James Version is still about another 70 years after him.
Oh, okay.
But the King...
I know Tyndale got into big trouble for doing it.
Yeah, correct. Oh, yeah, and I'll explain the story in a second. The King James, which is then published eventually in 1611,
right,
is coming on the back of about 7 other major English translations in the 150 years prior to it, so leading up to that point. But Tyndale's translation was one of those 7.
So what version is the Tyndale version then?
We call it the Tyndale, or the man who finished it. I can't remember his name, but I need to go back and have a look. One of his pupils finished it off.
That's called the Tyndale. If I want to look it up, it's the Tyndale version, is it?
I believe so.
Okay.
But I need to go and have a look. There's a series of transmission of about 7 major versions. John Wycliffe's version was the one before him. Tyndale's was the biggest one, and the first, what we generally speaking consider the first translation of the whole thing into English. Then there are a series of other ones: the Bishop's Bible, the Geneva Bible, etc.
I've seen those.
Yeah, those come in the decades after him, between Tyndale and eventually the.
What years was that again? Sorry.
He originally published in 1536. It's been a year or two since I looked it up, but I'll go back and look it up.
Sorry, we're making you work so hard.
No. 1536 is off memory, when he picked, because he publishes it in the, well, I'm saying to you, he publishes his editions. He doesn't finish it because he gets executed, but one of the major editions. Oh yeah, exclusively this. Yeah, it's a fascinating story. And so he then gets executed in 1536, which is that year.
Yeah, if it's not in the Latin Vulgate, it's not real.
I suppose, yes. So like I mentioned, Tyndale's translation becomes the basis for the subsequent English translations of the Great Bible, the Bishop's Bible, and then the King James itself. The New Testament, the New Testament English of the King James is overwhelmingly built on Tyndale's work. I think like 80 to 85% of it is the exact same verbiage.
Okay.
Tyndale and the line of transmission between Tyndale and the King James had a real standardising effect on the English language, either equally, if not actually probably more so than Shakespeare's works, which are in and around the same time.
It was a pretty poetic writing of the scriptures too. I mean, a lot of people just...
Yeah, it's they were using a formal equivalence philosophy, which is as equal, trying to, what does this word mean? Let's bring it as directly as we can into English, which is a good philosophy to have. But they wanted to also make it, especially the King James translators, because now, again, the English Reformation had well been seated. There's a bit of back and forth between Bloody Mary and Elizabeth I, and then after Elizabeth I, you then move into the time of James I and VI of England and Scotland, and hence the name King James Version or King James Bible. But now Protestantism the Protestant Reformation is firmly established in England, and there's a desire to carry with it a sense of majesty in the literal and figurative sense, I suppose. But yeah, his first incomplete translation was in 1525. Then the full New Testament was printed in 1526. That was the first full printed edition in English of the New Testament in history. Not that there hadn't been other partial English translations.
Were they using the Gutenberg printing press by that stage?
Oh yeah, Gutenberg printing press was invented in, I think, 1440 off memory.
So it's been 100 years.
It's been 100 years by that point. Yeah. The Gutenberg, yeah, exactly. That's why the Protestant Reformation occurred at the exact opportune time.
Okay.
70 to 80 years after the invention of the printing press. There we go. The Matthew Bible. Okay, so the Matthew Bible, which was the completion of Tyndale's full version. Because I'm saying he got killed in 1536 before he could complete it.
Bible.
Yeah, that's the completed version.
Okay.
That his pupil finished off. So yes, but the point I'm trying to draw here is with Tyndale. Tyndale's a very similar story. It's worth looking up. It's worth reading about and actually sitting down and reading through his biography. But in essence, Tyndale was extremely well-educated man. Tyndale, I've lost how many languages he knew. As a polyglot, I think in excess of 8 or 9 languages fluently. Maybe even more. It might have even been double digits. Like it's hard to keep track because there are some of the King James translators knew 15 different languages, and so a lot of those guys in the 1500s, 1600s were extremely fluent in some cases more than a dozen languages. But yes, Tyndale was extremely intelligent, university educated, obviously, of course, and was a minister as well, priest, and was tutoring a lot of the English aristocracy. There's a famous encounter where he's at dinner with the family of the son whose son he tutors, and the local. I'm pretty sure it's actually the local bishop from that part of England. And anyway, they get into a back and forth because Tyndale is very much on the side of guys like John Calvin and other reformers during that time, and Luther and whatnot. And they have a very heated exchange where Tyndale famously says to the bishop or priest, I will cause it to be that the ploughboy in the fields will know more of the scriptures than the Pope in Rome. Because again, the big issue by the time you get to the late medieval period is everything in the Christian religion in Western Europe is only in Latin.
And only accessible through the priests.
Yeah, and there's a natural barrier that occurs because only the clergy know Latin, which I mean obviously, and that's not a problem with Latin. It's also not a problem with the clergy knowing Latin. It's the problem is only the clergy knowing Latin. It's the only element. That's the problem, and so the entire service is done in Latin. So no one understands what's going on. They only know the small elements that they would be saying or singing, for example, a hymn or some such thing. But again, it's all phonetic memory, and how many people in the congregation actually know what the words actually mean when they're reciting the Gloria Patri in Latin, Gloria Patri et Filio et Spiritui Sancto, sic ut erat in principio et nunc et semper et in saecula saeculorum. Amen. Right? And they would repeat that, and no one could. And how many of them actually knew what on earth those words meant? Well,
is it pretty recent that the Catholic Church has said that it's okay not to have the services in Latin?
Yeah. Basically, post Vatican II, so 1965.
I thought it was really recent. Yeah.
And so, in the vernacular, just simply meaning the language that's spoken by that people group, is something that's quite important. There's a reason why the New Testament gets written in Greek, because that's the vernacular of the world at the time. It's very straightforward. Same as how during this exact same time in which we're reading here, the vernacular of the Old Testament was not Hebrew. It was Greek, which is why when they quote it, they quote the Greek version. Okay, the truth of principle transcends languages, right? There are differences and difficulties between languages because language is built around culture, it's built around religion. It's built around a whole bunch of things. So translating this into certain languages gets very, very interesting at times, but still is actually workable and doable because the essence of principle and truth could actually transcend those things. But so Tyndale then commits to translating the scriptures into English. He is then declared an outlaw in England. He flees to the continent, to Europe, and specifically into the heart of the Holy Roman Empire. To hide in plain sight while he translates. He's in Europe, there's more resources, comparatively speaking, than just England. And he then spends years and years and years, over a decade, from basically 1526 to 1536, essentially doing his work and being protected by an extremely complex and sophisticated protection network. He would be moved. There was a point there where for a couple of years he was basically moved every 2 days, so every 48 hours being moved.
So at this point he would, because if he was a minister, they were, so was he wouldn't have been married?
No, I need to look at where. I need to go back and look at them.
So you think he's a Catholic priest and
Yeah.
Well, like I mean, yeah, sure. Obviously, as a priest, no. But after he's been defrocked and then outlawed,
he doesn't need to be celibate anymore.
no. But I can have a look. I don't think he was married. I don't remember if anything about. I don't remember he had a family.
That would have been really hard if he's trying to keep.
I don't remember one, but I can quickly try and look. Yeah, I don't think so. I wouldn't have guessed so, but I don't think so. Yeah, it doesn't look like it. So I think my suspicion was correct. Yeah, correct. And so, yeah, an extremely complex thing. So what he was doing is, as again, the Gutenberg printing press, heavily used in Europe by this point now. They're printing millions and millions of copies eventually by the time you extrapolate it all out. And they would transport them back to England. Obviously, there's no use for them in Europe because no one speaks English on the continent. It's only in England, obviously. And so he would be working up and down along the Rhine, right, the Rhine River, which runs through Central and Western Europe, out into the North Sea. And they would transport these English translations in cargo ships, essentially filled with, wheat and other such things, and other such goods, and they would then obviously underneath they'd have them in secret compartments that have a whole bunch of English Bibles, and shipping them back and forth to England. And so there was this entire complex network of like thousands of people involved in secretly translating, secretly printing, secretly manufacturing, because it's not just the printing, it's also then the binding and all the manufacturing of it. And then all the transport and logistics, so guys who are responsible for transporting it this far up the Rhine to this port, then up to this port, then up to this port, then up to this port, then out across the sea, then up the Thames or up, various different places in and around England. And so this entire network in Europe and in England, from shop fronts to merchants to transport ships to knights and like guys who could protect, warriors who could protect, and this whole counter-espionage network.
Who was so opposed to it?
Who was opposed to it? The Kingdom of England. So the rulers of England at this time.
Christian at that time?
They are, but that's the whole issue of the Reformation. So the problem that had occurred was that significant elements of Christendom in Europe had, especially in the West, had become corrupted on certain doctrinal issues. And the issue then is that how that then influences power in institutions. The settled position was that everything must be in Latin, okay, which obviously the Reformers took objection with, which they should have, because the early church didn't believe that, and other such things.
But it removes the power that the whole priesthood would have in dispensing the word of God.
Correct.
Too.
So a big part of it had become the fact that that language barrier that I mentioned earlier, because the clergy were the ones who were educated, well, not the only ones, doctors were as well, and lawyers obviously as well, but up until like the 17th and 18th century, university was three things: law, medicine, divinity, i.e. theology. That's the basis of university. And every other subject has been an extrapolation out of that. So obviously when you go to university today, there's all kinds of degrees, useful or otherwise. But those are the three original departments. When you go back to the founding of Oxford in 1096, or Paris and Cambridge and other such things, those are the original three. And so they were university educated, but Latin was, because the scriptures were only in Latin, right? So the translation for the entirety of Western Europe was one single translation called the Latin Vulgate, which was a good translation, not as good as what we've got today, but a really good translation for when it was translated. It was translated back in the early 400s, so the early 5th century, by a scholar named Jerome. Did a very good job of what he had available. And for 1100 years, that was the translation in Western Europe. The thing is, peasants in England, France, Spain, Germany, wherever, don't know Latin, obviously. And so they can't sit down and do what we're doing here.
So,
just read, apart from the fact that they're illiterate, but that part.
Were there other movements for the German and the Spanish and the French to have the Bible translated?
Yes, all this is going on at the same time.
It's all happening at the same time.
Luther translates into German.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, Luther essentially standardised. So Luther literally standardised the German language.
Okay.
So standardised is, as the name suggests, it's where the language is really only spoken and it's into vernacular. There's some writings, but then a defining set of writing standardises all the grammar, the syntax. That's what a standardisation work is. So like the Quran for Arabic standardised the Arabic language. The German was standardised in the 16th century by Luther. Mm-hmm. English a bit less so, because the English tradition of writing has always been much more developed than other parts of Europe.
Okay.
But Tyndale's translation very much standardised to a great degree. So did Shakespeare's works as well.
And in Spain and Italy, did things happen there?
Yeah.
Well, Italy would be Rome. So.
Italy's a bit different. And so, yeah, Italy, there's still the relationship between Italian and Latin is obviously much closer. But Spanish, same deal. I'm not terribly familiar on the history of translation in regards to the Spanish. I need to have a look at it. But
French,
French similar deals. So again, the translation into the French vernacular is also occurring around this time as well.
So there's a lot of turmoil.
Yeah, pretty organic. Yeah, exactly. Pretty organic things that are popping up because it's all about the ideas. It's about the philosophy of it.
Okay.
About making it accessible. No. And again, it's not the first time. That's what I'm saying with regards to the English translation of the Bible, is that Tyndale's work was historic, like in the truest sense of the word. It wasn't like the first time that anything had ever been brought into English, though.
Okay.
His was the first full scope, complete Bible into English, obviously up until his death, and then his pupil finishes it off. Alfred the Great, King Alfred the Great, in the late 9th century, did a lot of English translations. He translated about 50 Psalms into English, obviously what would be Old English for us now. A number of different books, Old and New Testament, he translated into the vernacular of his day. So that whole concept of translating into the vernacular, even Alfred the Great did that.
Okay.
Because he was very educated, very learned.
You'd wonder where he got the time, though.
Well, yeah, that's why he's referred to Alfred the Great, because while he's also fighting off the Vikings and basically single-handedly saving England and the fate of the Anglosphere, he is promoting educational reforms. He reformed the entire education system of his realm. He promoted learning, all those kinds of things. Judicial law. He wrote what is the foundation of the common law system. All these kinds of things. But to make the point with Tyndale, Tyndale is then moved around Europe for 10 years, basically, while he's translating and doing all of his work. And the Holy Roman Empire, in league with the authorities in the Kingdom of England, are trying to hunt him down. They have mercenaries after him. They have bounty hunters after him. They have an entire spy network, an espionage network established. And so the secrecy of moving him, they moved him at night time, they moved him every 48 hours at some points. I think the longest he'd ever stay in a given location was like a week or 2 weeks. Constantly moving around, and this brought with it a whole host of things. When obviously he doesn't stop being a Christian, he's still going to the liturgy, to mass, to church services, but confined ones that are controlled and where there are guards posted and where people are vetted and they know who's who. He eventually gets brought down by, I forget his name off memory, because I'm saying it's been a year or two since I've thought about Tyndale, but the man's name who's escaped me was a spy for the Empire, and he had infiltrated their group about 2 years prior.
Oh, really? So it was very deep infiltration. Deep,
yeah. And so he'd worked his way into enough of close enough to Tyndale's proximity for about 2 years. And then one night they get word the authorities are coming. They go to move him. he's leading Tyndale out. They use body doubles, so they'd have body doubles for Tyndale. So if the authorities ever came, all of a sudden 5 Tyndales are running around everywhere. So it becomes a very sophisticated counter-espionage network. And he's leading the real Tyndale. They head out, down, turn down one alleyway, dead end, authorities. Done.
Yep, done.
And he gets captured.
The Judas.
Yeah, basically, and he gets captured. He then gets transported back to England, and he's then burnt at the stake.
Oh, right. So they.
And he dies.
That'd be Henry VIII. 36 is Henry
36, yeah. So Henry VIII rises to the throne, I think, in third.
Late 14, right at the end.
I thought
No, it's early.
burning at the stake was reserved for heretics. I thought it would have been gallows or something like that.
No, because he's considered a heretic.
Oh, okay.
I'm saying he's declared a heretic. He's already been declared a heretic by the Pope, and he's been declared an outlaw in England.
Okay.
Well, and everywhere else, I suppose. But yeah, no, that would have been under Henry VIII, I believe, off memory. Unless
Henry
Henry
VIII.
VIII didn't want to be necessarily, my understanding.
Yeah, that's.
Didn't want to be.
It's still-
Protestant. He wanted to be Catholic.
ish. It's his coronation was back in like 1500 something. I need to go back and have a look.
But wasn't Henry VIII established the Anglican Church?
Yeah, but this is what happens though. So I'll show you. So
Okay.
I'm with you.
I'm a bit confused.
So he rises. So Henry VIII ascends the throne in 1509. So I said 1500 something. I was sort of kind of close.
Elizabeth, the last one, dies in 1603. So it's
Correct.
basically the whole of the 15th.
Yeah, this is the
It's easy to understand.
yes,
It's easy to
this is the middle of the
remember.
Tudor dynasty.
Don't
Yes,
remember
correct.
anything else.
But yes, exactly. And so, but that all then happens. Again, that's 1536 that Tyndale is executed. And this is a fascinating story. Tyndale's dying words as he's being burnt at the stake were, "Lord, open the eyes of the King of England."
Oh, really? Wow.
Within it's some very, very short time period. I want to say a month off the top of my head, but I could be wrong. I'm saying to you, I'm trying to recall everything from like a couple of years ago. He said he dies saying, "Lord, open the eyes of the King of England," and it's within a very short time frame that the acts of, I just need to remember what the actual act is that Henry VIII passed. But it's then like very shortly after that Henry VIII officially and publicly rejects papal supremacy, makes the constitutional reform, brings in the law, and along with Thomas Cranmer, effectively launches the English Reformation.
Right. Wow.
It's very, very short. It's within like, I need to go back again. The specifics I need to go back and have a look at, but it's within a very short time frame. And so Tyndale's dying words were fulfilled very quickly. Lord, open the eyes of the King of England, and then he then converts to Protestantism. Yeah.
Okay.
And so
Bibles, I mean, this is a big question. First edition, you said they were getting these Bibles out.
First editions of Tyndale's, there may well be. There are certainly first editions of things like the Bishop's Bible, and the Great Bible, the Geneva Bible. The Geneva Bible is used over obviously in Geneva, Switzerland, but those kinds of scriptures. You can get fragments of them, or a page from one, or other such things, if you have a reasonable amount of money.
I'm just wondering
because they're valuable historical.
How can you
documents.
prove the providence though if you've only got a bit of it?
Because they come from pretty controlled sources. It's kind of it's a similar way in which the authentication of artwork, for example. There are institutions and funds and other such things which have been around for centuries and centuries that are able to verify the provenance of a given document or other such things like that. Yeah. But the point to draw with Tyndale is that Tyndale. I was reminded of Tyndale when I was reading through this in preparation, obviously, because the way in which Tyndale was protected, a bunch of guys died protecting Tyndale, like a lot of guys.
Wow.
plenty of, how many, there probably would be a number if we could ever find it, but dozens, if not maybe even potentially over 100 people.
So is it mainly against the Roman Church that he...
The problems were, yes, correct. And especially, and for Tyndale specifically, in terms of his what he was doing, it was all about the language. By translating into English, now the people of England, at least the ones who were literate, obviously, could actually read the Bible without having to spend 10 plus years trying to learn Latin, which they didn't have access to do anyway. And so the way you can see why corrupt powers, again, because it's perfect. So this is the beauty of Christianity. So we can admit where things have gone wrong while still admitting the truthfulness, because we can actually measure it against the truth. Other religions have a very difficult time of doing that. The issue is that because the scriptures were only in one language and only one very tiny group of guys actually knew the language, the ability in terms of like power to control things, religiously, politically, or otherwise, was problematic. When I get up and say something, especially today, and especially because I put it on camera, put it on the internet, anybody anywhere who can understand my words, in other words, who knows English, can check whether I'm right or wrong. Do you know what I mean? Just like when we're sitting here now. Even something as simple as what this literal passage even actually says, you can check whether I'm actually reading it correctly, right? If we started in verse 28 and as you're reading from verse 28 onward, and I started by saying, "Now it happened that while Apollos was at Corinth, Paul passed through the upper regions and came into Ephesus and found the disciples," you'd go, or he's not reading the right passage, or he's not reading the right thing at all, right? Because you can read it. Go back 600 years ago, and you have no option but to take my word for it. Do you know what I mean? That's the problem. Now, it doesn't mean that the entire clergy were corrupt. No, the entire clergy weren't corrupt. Elements of it were corrupt, and more importantly, the system itself conceptually had become corrupted. Right? That's the problem. Because now you have to take the clergyman's word for it, and it's entirely possible the clergyman's telling you the truth, as often occurred. It's also entirely possible that he's lying to you. The problem is you don't have a way to distinguish because you don't know Latin. You can't read it. You have no idea what it actually says. You're totally dependent. It's not about being dependent. It's being totally dependent where there's no other options. Do you know what I mean? And that's where it's essentially a form of clerical totalitarianism in one sense. Right? I suppose you could phrase it as. And it's a problem. And so that's one thing that the Reformation solved. By translating the Bible into into French, German, English, Spanish, Norwegian, Russian, etc. You now had a scenario over the course of the last 500 years where now everyone can read it.
So I thought the Reformation was primarily a change in the way that the theology was presented,
Oh yeah,
justified through faith alone.
Yeah.
Hadn't realised that part of that was also the translation of all the
humongous part
into everybody's vernacular.
Absolutely humongous part of it. One of the most important things that Luther ever did was translate the Bible into German. One of the most important things, if not the most, actually. If Luther had said nothing doctrinally but just translated the Bible into German, it still would have been a net positive. Okay. Right. Because Luther's a very similar thing. Luther presents his views, and again, he initially was not seeking. This is why, again, the good intentions of the Reformation. He was a scholar. He was a PhD. He was a professor at the University of Wittenberg, which was a pretty new university by that time. Doctor of theology and philosophy, theology, and the famous thing that we mark on October 31st, 1517, really in terms of the actual impact literally on the day was much ado about nothing.
Like nailing up the notice.
Yeah, nailing up his 95 doctrinal theses, right? So, so theses of so in other words, an academic thesis, was him just posting something on the notice board. And again, he posted it in Latin, because Latin's the language of the universities. So it wasn't even for the peasant, because none of the peasants walking by through the marketplace or through the public square been able to read it. So that shows you again, this wasn't him trying to start. So when Luther gets accused of trying to start a revolution, it fails before it even gets off the tarmac, because he posted this document in Latin, which meant he was talking to fellow academics, not like trying to whip the peasants into a revolt, because the peasants can't read Latin, right? If he was trying to do that, he would have written in German, but he didn't, because he was simply trying to have an academic discussion about some of the problems theologically that were going on. Indulgences, and indulgence was a big one. There's a number of different things, 95 of them, obviously. But yeah, and so Luther is eventually brought over the course of years. That's 1517. By the time you get to 1521, he's eventually brought before Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor. He's brought before the Pope. He's brought before the Pope's lawyers, before the canon lawyers of the Holy See and of the Empire. Is made to, or is demanded to recant. He doesn't do this famous speech where he says, like, "Here I stand, I can do no other," blah blah blah. And he's then released, but then is declared an outlaw. And outlawry is a punishment worse than death, because outlawry, being declared an outlaw, is, as the name suggests, you're now outside the law. You are outside any legal protections. It's essentially a death sentence. Anybody
can kill you and there's no recourse against them.
Correct, because you no longer actually are recognised as having personhood legally. And so he's declared an outlaw, but he's protected by a particular Prince Frederick, who was very sympathetic to Luther, and who joined the Reformation, and he's protected in a place called Wartburg Castle. And that's where he then translates into German and blah, 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 blah. Okay. But the translation into the vernacular is something that's extremely important, because now everyone can read it, and now everyone can learn it, and now everyone can actually check for themselves, all these kinds of things. Not that they should check. Again, it also has negatives when you get imbalance, because it's also the case that the reason why things like Mormonism and Jehovah's Witnesses and everyone else exist is because they can also read it in English, and they can come up with their own equally erroneous understandings and translations and everything else. So there's a balance to it. That's why you've got to remain balanced, but nevertheless. Tyndale and other such figures are very reminiscent of this kind of scenario, where Tyndale was protected at all costs to the point of the cost of people's lives. Luther was protected to the cost of people's lives. Like, guys died protecting Luther, guys died protecting Tyndale, because they recognised very honourably that in the providence of God, he was doing something big and meaningful through this guy, Tyndale, for example, or through Luther, or through whoever, etc. And that they were willing to suffer hardship and imprisonment and even sacrifice their life to be part of something that was a worthy cause. Here, Gaius and Aristarchus are, I would argue, very much doing that. They would not have wanted Paul to come to that theatre. They would have wanted him to be protected at all costs. So, let's go back. We are in verse 32. So then some were shouting, the group that is, some of the group was shouting one thing and some another, for the meeting was in confusion, and the majority of the crowd did not know for what reason they had come. Well, I could sit here all day talking 1,000 different points that you can draw from this. But this is really speaking to the heart. This is Luke very cleverly identifying one of the core fundamental problems with this whole ordeal. You have thousands, if not probably potentially tens of thousands of Ephesians here, whipped up into a frenzy, and much of the group, in fact the majority, he says, the majority of the people, so the majority of potentially 10 to 20,000 people, we don't have many, but thousands, if not tens of thousands, the majority of them were so much going with the flow, as we would say, that they didn't even really actually understand the core reasons as to why this whole thing was even going on. And yet they're all standing around screaming, "Great is Artemis to the Ephesians," and they're all filled with rage and anger, and they can't even, and they didn't even really understand what on earth they were meant to be angry about.
So such a human thing, like
an extremely human thing.
Not a good way, but
Yes.
Time for Taylor Swift.
Yeah, exactly. And this goes, and anyone, the fortunate thing about the last 3 years, be it from differences of opinion on COVID and vaccines and mandates and other such things, or be it from differences of opinion on Ukraine and Russia, one side or the other, be it on differences of opinion between Israel and Palestine, again, one side or the other, we've now got like replete examples of this exact kind of thing, is that over the last, even just those 3 issues I mentioned, I'm just going to broadly classify it as COVID, Russia, Ukraine, Israel, Palestine, just for the sake of simplicity. There are well-reasoned thinking opinions on different sides of the issue, and they constitute a minority. Right? Okay, in all three things, you can find on both sides, right? So if you go back to COVID, right, my positions on the whole COVID ordeal are very, very clear. But I'm still honest enough to admit that there were people who were doing their level best to think critically, and who took the exact polar opposite position to me on the issue, right? I was, and I have no shame in saying so, I was very critically outspoken against widespread mandates, especially in the private sector. I was very outspoken against widespread implementation of the unthinking implementation of things like masks. But I'm also, again, some of the points, I'm objective enough to realise that there are people on the other side of the issue who were also doing their level best to think through things as well. The issue, though, is that was not the majority of people, because the majority of people, whether they line up on this side or the other, were doing so out of the exact same kind of premise here, and especially in regards to the blind following of, that's right, the blind following of what other people happen to be saying.
I actually had to change my mind, because I had one particular view on masks, and then I saw some visual evidence, and I actually had to change my mind on masks from what I saw.
Yeah, but see that at least, and that's my point about where people line up on. The biggest problem with regards to the COVID ordeal, to stick on that subject, is that is the first and biggest problem throughout that I would argue for us to learn from is not even necessarily what side someone lined up on. No. Even though I think that's a very, very valid discussion. Well, obviously my opinions are obvious on that, but I think the first, and I've actually said this before, but I think the bigger issue is underlying what side of the issue people lined up on, which was namely how they actually got from A to Z.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
That's the bigger issue, right? So by that what I mean is, whatever conclusion they landed up on, if they did so with really little to no critical thinking, that's the real heart of the issue, even more than what actual conclusion they landed on. Because the danger is more in the process than the conclusion. The danger is more in blindly supporting or following X, whatever it happens to be, with no genuine attempt to think rationally, to think critically, to try and arrive at objective truth, right? That's the fundamental core issue. And you've then seen that play out with Russia and the Russia-Ukrainian war. You've seen that playing out right now with Israel and Palestine, of the blind support for X cause, whatever happens to be. The blind support element is more problematic than even the support of X, right? That's even more problematic. I'm saying to you, the process is, not because the conclusion's unimportant, but the process of how you arrive at the conclusion is what becomes really, really dangerous. Because if you can be blindly swung towards X or Y or Z blindly, then you can be swung to any part of the alphabet.
You're rudderless.
You're completely rudderless. Yes, exactly. You are caught in a hurricane.
I also argue too, like and I'm guilty of this as well, but especially these days, when people have a set idea on one particular topic that's really super current, like potato stuff, then you automatically assume you're going to think the same on all these other things. Like, it seems to be,
yes.
I don't know, there's that thing, and there's also not this time of engaging and you know,
It-
and going.
they're saying that
why
exact-
do you think that? Or,
that exact-
having a happy disagreement. on
That exact problem where, you know, if you think this way, then you think XXX about all these other things.
Yeah.
Correct.
On
Is
all
the,
those other
is
subjects.
the biggest problem that's facing both sides of the American political parties,
Yeah.
in that they've now
Yeah, it's a very
they're
obvious example.
siloed.
Big box.
They've all
Yeah.
siloed down,
and we're
there's
getting
no
there. We're basically almost there too. Yeah.
there's no differentiation for,
Yeah.
for
Correct.
yeah.
Because of the way in which, well, and that's the kind of nefarious side of the party element of kind of the modern democratic conceptualization of party politics. But you saw this, for example, in the a couple of months ago in the voice referendum. Is that, again, irrespective of where someone lined up, one thing which should be which I think is an objective observation, is that there tended to be the premise float around that Indigenous Australians only had one opinion on the subject. Okay? Irrespective of what you ended up voting for, that's a problem. The collectivist generalizations, right? The collectivistic generalizations, I should really say. Well, the results from the Northern Territory shoot a RPG right through that idea, right? Just shoots a rocket straight through it, because it's very, very clear that no, there wasn't just, here's what Aboriginal people believe about this. No, very clearly not. Very, very, very clearly not. And that's what you get, the completely just overly simplistic rendering of what an entire people group of about 1 million people think about a given subject, as if they all have one collective brain that they somehow share, that's like, hiding under Uluru that they all plug into. There's only one thing that they actually think about a subject. If you want to talk about anything that actually genuinely starts teetering on the lines of racism, that would actually be it. Thinking that a people group have one singular opinion on a given subject. There's no people group on earth, including Christians, who have a singular opinion on something. Not in the kind of sum total sense. But the blind, unthinking, reactionary mob mentality is what you're witnessing here. What you're witnessing here is exactly why, the irony of ancient Greece is that it's the birthplace of democracy, but it's also the exact same place where just about everyone in ancient Greece who ever wrote about democracy universally decried it for this reason. You can pick anyone you want. You can pick any of them. You can pick Plato. You can pick Aristotle. You can pick Diogenes. You can pick a whole host of different other figures. Pericles, probably the greatest democratic leader of Athens in classical Greece in the 5th century. Even he kind of eventually, more or less, threw his hands up in the air and gave up to one degree.
Was it Socrates that had to argue his own defence and they just ignored him and killed him anyway?
Well, Socrates is an interesting story. So Socrates Socrates suffered from this exact same kind of instance. Yeah. Socrates was charged by the Ecclesia of Athens, so the assembly, the assembly of the 500, with corrupting the youth of Athens. In other words, basically they were essentially charging him with atheism.
But it was a trumped-up charge.
In reality, yes. Socrates' views on theology are complex and a little bit unknown, because everything we get about Socrates comes from Plato, and Plato spends more time focusing on other things from Socrates than that. Socrates probably had... the substance of it is a much deeper philosophical and historical discussion, but the point is that that Socrates was charged with corrupting the youth of Athens, and by essentially teaching a version of atheism was the charge. Now, he was condemned to death, but the kind of Athenian custom for aristocrats and for wealthy, powerful, or more prominent figures like he was, obviously, for those kinds of people, the kind of custom was that we will sentence you to death, and it was like an unspoken rule. They were kind of expected to escape and basically live in kind of self-exile for about a decade or so, and then they could maybe probably come back. Except Socrates kind of calls their bluff and doubles down and actually decides to drink the hemlock that they give him, which no one was expecting him to do, as just basically a kind of parting middle finger.
They had it in for him because he actually said himself, "It's the way that I question you
Yes.
And that's embarrassing.
Yes, correct. That was the real substance of the issue. The real problem.
He asks questions all the time. That's kind of
Yeah, so the Socratic method
Of the
as we
aristocracy,
talk-
yes.
Yeah, the Socratic, it's what we call the Socratic method. So obviously in the name of Socrates. So the way that Socrates engaged in dialogue, which is more than just like a dialogue is a Greek word. They are two logos, words or speech. So two people conversing, is a formal, kind of like what we'd call a formal discussion or a formal debate, right? It's not just a casual chat. When he would engage in a dialogue, which is where two intellectuals, two philosophers are actually having a battle of ideas, quote unquote, he was famous for doing it through questions. So he'd ask a question, they'd give an answer. He'd then ask a follow-up question based on their answer, and then a follow-up question again based on it. So working his way through questioning is very, very clever. And it's called Socratic reasoning or Socratic questioning, where, rightly so, and he's 100% correct, by asking question after question after question, it's like unwrapping a gift or something, or it's like a babushka doll, you keep on to get to the small one, right? You're unpacking the issue until you get to the heart of the principle behind the subject.
Is that what made him so unpopular? Is it just the way he did it?
A big reason for it is that the way Socrates actually went about it was the fact that through his I'll just be blunt, through his sheer genius and his ability to ask extremely well-constructed logical questions, to do that requires a pretty decent intellect, because you've got to be quick, you've got to be smart, you've got to be picking up on issues, and you've got to be thinking on the fly. And you're not just stating something, you're actually asking a question. So you actually have to know. It's like you're aiming for a target and you're leading them to a certain conclusion.
Okay.
It's very clever, right? And so.
I'm getting really peed off.
Yeah, exactly, and that's where exactly so Socratic philosophy was a big part of my philosophical training in university. So, and so that's why I can talk to it. And so that kind of thing though is that you are basically leading the horse to water, right? By asking questions. When you ask questions in a Socratic way, you can actually guide the conversation. You know where you want to get to. So there's even this prescience of knowing I want to get from A to Z and here's how I'm going to do it. And the other person's constantly on the back foot because they're just answering questions. You're actually asking them. It's like an investigator conducting an interrogation in a police setting. They're asking a series of questions because they want to get from here to there and get to a confession. Do you know what I mean? And so the thing is, though, is that for those who are not as smart as Socrates, especially those in power, you end up looking like an idiot because he can just outwit you. And
so they trump up some charges,
and people don't generally being made to look like people don't usually enjoy. Yeah, but he embarrassed them. Yeah. People at any level, especially more powerful people, don't generally like being made to look like an idiot. And so he made them look like fools. And so they then wielded the levers of power to oust him. Very famous, and that's what I'm saying. They kind of expected him to do what was the Athenian custom, which was, the night before he was to be executed, kind of escape, because that happened all the time, and then live in exile and then come back in like 10 years. Yeah, it was a very common custom. Yeah. Not for peasants, for powerful, well-known, for famous figures. They would all of a sudden magically escape because maybe the gate got left unlocked.
So basically, it saves martyrdom. It saves him always being in their face. He's out of the way. Yeah,
and to self-exile and go live off somewhere else in Greece for 10 years and come back. That happened on a number of famous occasions. But he actually doubled down and called their bluff and actually chose to drink the hemlock poison that they gave him. So anyway. But the whipping into the mob, so that Socrates was really ultimately a victim of the mob, because as much as the powerful, but the way that Socrates got executed was because the power players in Athens whipped the Athenian people into a mob in order to get them on their side, it's one of the fundamental issues. Again, I know. Unfortunately, the Book of Acts keeps circling me back to this point, but it's one of my principal arguments politically for monarchism is that these things become very difficult to do. It was John Adams, I believe, off memory, one of the American founding fathers, son of the Constitution, son of the Declaration of Independence, etc. When speaking to the nature of the United States Constitution, said that our Constitution is for a moral and religious people, and it is entirely inadequate to the governance of any other. Okay.
Interesting comment.
And when he says moral and religious, that's just an 18th century way of saying Christian, in other words.
Yeah.
Our Constitution is for moral and religious people, or for Christian people who are guided by morality, who are guided by a set of ethics and codes and blah, blah.
So the Constitution's total rubbish now because...
Well, it's the fundamental thing is that and again, my historical opinions on this are complex, but in essence, what Adams is saying there is he's 100% correct, apart from the fact that he's one of the signers and framers of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. But his point there is that it's entirely inadequate to the governance of any other, because as the American founding fathers framed things often in the Federalist Papers and other such writings that they conducted, the new American Republican enterprise, which was really kind of a revival of ancient Roman republicanism, especially the Platonic form, mixed together with new Enlightenment era ideals. And again, my thoughts on that are complex, but it gave so much unprecedented freedom and liberty to these Englishmen residing in North America. Because now, especially things through the First Amendment, the First Amendment, Second Amendment, Third Amendment to a lesser degree, the ability of self-governance, which is really what the American enterprise is founded upon, of the separation of powers, the formation of state rights over federal rights and powers, so on and so forth, and the concept of self-governance. Well, self-governance requires an unfailing fidelity to a moral and ethical code that you are disciplined to maintain. And that, of course, is the Christian ideal, right, obviously. The problem comes with what happens when people stop doing that. That's the problem. It's also why I believe it was either John Adams again, or it might have actually been Benjamin Franklin, I think. I need to go back and have a look. When they were coming out of one of the Continental Congresses, where they were deciding, this is at a real big precipice point in the late 1780s, before the final framing of the Constitution in 1789. They are still teetering between, should we become a republic or should we be a new monarchy? Right? They're going back and forth. You've got figures like Hamilton and other such founding fathers who are arguing for monarchy. You've got others like Jefferson and Franklin who are arguing for republic, really a kind of very democratic form of republic.
I would have thought they would have been totally anti-monarchy.
Oh, no. Because they were originally in the kind of constitution before the American Constitution was called the Articles of Confederation. Very, very, very democratic. The problem was it was a dumpster fire, and so the Constitution, the US Constitution, was kind of the way to fix it.
Is a president sort of like a pseudo-monarch then?
Yes, correct. Yeah,
Okay.
That's why they have a lot of the powers of the monarch. In fact, actually, the US president's more powerful than any monarch that's ever lived, by far. Yeah, well, by far. No, it's not. Oh, it's not even close. No, that's the thing. Is the irony of the anti-monarchical position in America is very, very ironic, because there's not a single king in the history of the world that's ever had as much power as the American president. Louis XIV, who's generally held up as the most powerful medieval monarch, Louis XIV of France, Le Sol Roy.
I would have thought Napoleon would have been more powerful.
Well, Napoleon's after the Middle Ages. I'm just referring to medieval kings,
sorry.
right? In the time of absolute monarchy, divine right of the kings, Louis XIV would have blushed at the powers that the US president has, and Napoleon couldn't conduct warfare on the far side of the planet with the push of a button.
Yeah. Okay.
All those kinds of powers.
He tried.
Well, I suppose he tried, yes. He tried. But so the point I was going to make with regards to whether it was Franklin or Adams, I can't remember which one, but when they came out of that Constitution, that's where they finally settled on, no, we're going to be a republic. One of the wives of one of the founding fathers asked again, either Franklin or Adams, can't remember which one it was. What shall it be, a republic or a monarchy? Right, in other words, what was the conclusion? And he just gave this very laconic one-line answer: a republic if you can keep it. Okay. A republic if you can keep it. In other words, if you can keep it, as in like if we can hold this thing together. Because, and that's why I think it was Adams. I can't remember. It could have been Benjamin
To this
Franklin.
day, they still call it the Great Experiment.
Yeah, it's still called the Great Experiment, the American experiment, right, of self-governance. And again, my thoughts on this are complex, but yeah, the thing is that it requires self-discipline, it requires self-governance, it grants an immense amount of freedom and liberty, comparatively speaking, historically, but it also requires critical thinking. It requires being governed by a higher authority, namely God. It requires being disciplined to Christian morality. And as soon as that goes out the window, a system like America, well, you're witnessing what happens.
Well, we've lost on critical thinking from the
Yep,
start.
you're witnessing what happens. Yep,
It's really interesting because I used to.
and that speaks to the heart of this very passage. But yeah,
I was always very, Republican, like let's get rid of our monarch, and I'm not by any means in awe of the British royal family, I have to be honest,
Sure,
as
yeah.
people, but I'm actually going to rethink all of that. That's really weird.
Yeah, and it's not,
I
it's
can tell you.
yeah, no, I know, and look, that's why I try to keep it in the pocket.
This is a democracy at all. You get like a split second where you do that tick in the box who you want, and then that's it. They do whatever they want after.
But who's chosen who you're going to tick?
Yeah, that's the big issue. But see, this is why, yeah, correct. Yeah, and that's the difficulty, exactly. Like it's not, it's yeah, this is an extremely wide, this is a very complex subject, obviously we could talk about forever, but yeah, no, but that's, no, don't apologize. That's the 21st century is going to have those kinds of questions. I've made my positions on it pretty clear. I've been very public about my monarchist views for a while. Not that that's something very edgy. I just simply, I find far greater value in the high and late medieval monarchical system, and more importantly, I actually argue upon biblical grounds that it's the more biblical model. But that's a different
Also, they take more responsibility. I mean, not the monarch now, not the British.
No, but see,
It's a life trained position.
You know who to pick. You know who to point a finger to if things go
yeah,
wrong.
that's one of my central points. Yeah, correct. No one when
Now, who do you point the finger at? They all
No, you can't.
blame each other. And
Correct.
It's all, no, it's them.
No, correct, and we've all got a witness of that. Even during COVID,
Yeah,
when things were going wrong, we would think that the health minister is the one where the buck stops here.
Nope.
No.
Was there any time in which, again, the first side of question towards New South Wales would have been Brad Hazzard at the time, health minister? Oh, you have to ask the chief health officer about that. We have to ask them about that. Well, I'll bring up such and such. Anyone but the elected official was the one who actually answered the question. Anytime any of them ever got a question about anything, it was always obfuscating to some other poor public servant.
Some of that could have been just the complexity of the
I don't
situation.
I don't disagree with that.
You needed specialisations
Yeah,
to answer.
no, I don't disagree with that.
I actually know someone very high up in the police force who's now, he does law in the police force, and he worked during the COVID thing directly with Terry Champ with Brad Hazzard. Which this will tie into why they've had to refund all these people their money, because Brad Hazzard was telling them to do things where there was no law for. In other words, illegal stuff. So that he was actually saying, right, we're locking all these people up. Well, how do we do that? They can't eat a kebab on that bench. There's no law. We're looking for this law, Bradley, but there
the
isn't
issue-
one.
Hazard has shown his true colours with the friendly Geordies since.
Well, that's definitely true. Yes, correct.
So he was,
Yeah, but that's the issue with the way of that issue specifically was to do with the fact that the Public Health Act of 2010 gave such an unprecedented level of plenary power.
Yeah.
I think off memory it was Section 7 of that law. Don't quote me on that, but I think it was Section 7 gave the health minister the authority essentially to make literally any ordinance, any. So long as and it was even vague as to whether or not it was allowed to violate other legislative.
There are many laws like that. The Section 44 Fires Act gives the
that's true actually.
gives the officers of the local fire brigade the power of God to destroy anything to take anything they need
Yeah.
in order to perform their duty of putting out the
Yeah,
fires.
and that's the level of absolutism. See, that's my point. That's what I meant about Louis XIV, who is kind of the archetypal time. The time of absolute monarch in Europe is kind of the 1500s, 1600s, trailing into the 1700s, but particularly 1600s, 1700s. Louis XIV is kind of the example of that. Louis XIV could never just do whatever he wanted, because it was all still, even for him, under the principle. That's where the whole concept of divine right of the kings is, that we look at it as, the king was only answerable to God, no human authority. Now, there's some question, I have some issues about that, because that wasn't the medieval conception.
Right.
But even still, he was still at least answerable to God. Right, he was still answerable to God, but right, and so there was no time in which, again, it's a very Hollywood version where like medieval kings could just simply say, oh, and off with his head, and off with their head, and steal his money, and give me his no, that never happened. No, that couldn't happen and didn't happen. And if they did that, if they turned tyrannical, they often found a way of losing their own head. All of a sudden, they might just happen to be poisoned in their sleep at night. You know what I mean? And so the power of being able to whip a mob into a frenzy is one of the byproduct of democracy. That's what I'm saying. One of the ironies of the modern democratic movement is that everyone in ancient Greece who writes about democracy universally decries it, and that's not an exaggeration. You cannot find a single person in ancient Athens or anywhere else who goes, oh no, this all worked out really well. No one. Plato, Aristotle, Socrates obviously, but the whole box and dice. Political, philosophical, military, because of the question of, well, who is actually able to think critically and who's actually able to be rational and reasonable. And this group here is the antithesis of reason and rationality. Like Luke literally explains, because it would have been obvious, and the majority didn't even know for what reason they'd come together. They couldn't even tell you what on earth this great brouhaha was even about. They're all just standing around shouting this chant of "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." They're all just standing around screaming at the top of their lungs, and the majority don't even know what on earth's even going on. They just know we're all here and we're all angry about something. I'm angry about whatever he's angry about. And I'm angry about whatever he's angry about. Right? Do you know what I mean? It's a dumpster fire.
I share your anger. What are we angry
Yeah.
about again?
Correct.
You're all individuals.
Exactly. So the rest of the that's all the complexities out of the way. The rest of the passage, fortunately, is pretty straightforward. So verse 34 through to the end. But when they recognised that he was a Jew...
I was going to ask this, if we jumped 33, I think.
Oh, we have, so yes, good point.
So who is this guy? I mean...
Alexander?
Yeah, but he's been put forward by...
I'll explain.
Thank you, please.
Yeah. Sorry, yes, verse 33. And some of the crowd concluded that it was Alexander, since the Jews had put him forward, and having motioned with his hand, Alexander was intended to make a defence to the assembly. Now, we have absolutely no idea who this Alexander was.
Okay, first done. Let's move on.
Yeah, first done. Alexander, obviously a very generic name, obviously, in Greece, very popular name. This Alexander was obviously a Jew. So basically what this was, and here's what the landscape is. This is why being able to zoom out and see the whole story, picture as a whole. Paul, ethnic Jew. Gaius and Aristarchus, also probably ethnic Jew, but they're Christians, right? The Jews, the apostate Jews, those who are not Christians, would have immediately gone, oh snap, they're going to think they're with us.
Oh, right. So it was like, not us.
Not us. That's what this is. This is them. This is him. This is him. This is the Jews going. This is the Jews saying to. Obviously, Alexander was either just a good speaker, or he was well known in town, or something, right? And the Jews who have been as much against Paul and the Christians as the rest of the Ephesians have, are basically saying to him, "Get up there and do something. Like tell them they're not with us." Right?
So there's this other facet coming into this whole crowd going, okay, they're yelling at someone. Let's make sure it's not us.
The Jews here are trying to make it really clear they're not with us. Right? We have no king but Caesar, like they've been saying for years now. We're with you guys.
But that just
pagan Ephesians.
That just went worse for them.
Well, yeah, correct. It didn't. No, because you can't out. It's the tide of the mob. It's a rip tide. You can't outswim it. And so there's no placating here. And so they throw forward this poor bugger Alexander to try and make a defence to the assembly. You know, that we're not here. That's why in verse 34, and when they recognised that he was a Jew, a single cry arose from them all as they shouted for about 2 hours, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." Right? So he tried to placate the crowd and saying, no, we're not with them. They didn't care because they were just seeing they were seeing red. And Paul and the other Christians are, at least the core of them, like Paul and whatnot, are ethnically Jews. There's obviously plenty of Gentiles now, but Paul and co are Jew, and so they're not making the distinction between any. They're just seeing all of them, and so their attempt to placate the crowd miserably fails. It's like when there were Black Lives Matter riots in the US, and you know you can find video footage of people living in inner city Chicago, for example, and they're they're waving a BLM flag out their apartment, like, yeah, we support you, and then a rock comes flying through because they're a riotous crowd of thugs and other such things at that point. By the time that it evolved to the summer of love, it gets called now, when the mostly peaceful riots of burning and looting,
like the Californian race riots
that occurred, yeah, exactly, like back in '92, or these ones in 2020, yeah. And they're like, no, we're on your side. They don't care because they were a riotous mob by that point. And so verse 35, now again, they're cheering for hours and hours and hours, again, whipped into a complete emotional frenzy.
I'm just wondering what the Romans are doing at this stage.
Well, by the time we get to the end where the mayor speaks, it becomes, the point of that kind of comes into view. So verse 35, now after calming the crowd, the city clerk, basically it's a kind of equivalent to a mayoral position, basically. The local magistrate, in other words, the city clerk or the city mayor said, "Men of Ephesus." So he finally was actually able to get a voice in after hours of riotous chanting and everything else. "Men of Ephesus, what man is there after all who does not know that the city of the Ephesians is guardian of the temple of the great Artemis and of the image which fell down from heaven?" The belief in Ephesus by the time you get to the first century was that the famous statue of Artemis in Ephesus, which we kind of mentioned in passing reference last week, that it was a sign from the goddess, that it had come down from the heavens. That was the prevailing view. For us historically, what that has led to the conclusion that perhaps, if not actually potentially probably, that the Ephesian statue was actually the Artemisian statue of Ephesus was actually carved out of a meteorite.
Wow. Okay. Oh. That has to be nickel iron. That's not easy stuff to cut.
No, it's not. And so that's what it's us trying to make an interpretation of what that means, right? But it's possible because, so for example, Pliny the Elder, the famous Roman historian who's from the first century, right? Who's alive literally at this time, he makes this kind of reference to the statue of Artemis. And such. This is the only place that gives it in this literal kind of, this very blunt literal kind of rendering. But
it's the only meteor that's actually will survive re-entry is the super dense nickel iron.
Yeah, super dense ones. Yes, correct. There was the belief that it had come down as a sign from Jupiter. So in other words, or to the Greeks, Zeus. And that appears to be a pretty common part of the kind of mythological principles in Ephesus. And so it's suspected then that perhaps it was carved out of a meteorite. But either way, point being that this is what...
Meteorite?
Nice.
Yeah.
Some of them are pretty big.
Yeah, some of them can be. And that one, as I mentioned, that Artemisian statue of Ephesus is, I think, somewhere around like 5 to 6 feet. I can't remember. I looked at it a while back. But
if they stay solid, they actually do less damage. It's when they do an air explosion, exactly. They do the most damage.
An air burst, yeah. It's that's when they really, yeah, you are right, correct. But yes, anyway, point being, that unless I can find, 1 second.
There was actually a meteorite found out on Tablin's Road that was quite rare, and the guy sold it to the Sydney Australian Museum for quite a few $1,000s, in the tens of the thousands of dollars.
Yeah, they're not cheap.
Yeah, you just found it with a metal detector.
Yeah. Yeah. Of the few that survived that kind of entry, yeah. But so that's where that belief is probably almost certainly, again, well, almost certainly that's plenty of a claim. That's where that is likely coming from, or probably coming from. I'm trying to use a bit more accurate historical language. But point being, again, what the clerk is doing here, though, what the city mayor is doing here is he's reassuring them of their fundamental beliefs, basically. Verse 36, so since these are undeniable facts, question mark, but since these are undeniable facts, you ought to keep calm and do nothing rash. For you have brought these men here who are neither robbers of temples nor blasphemers of our goddess. Now the question is here, when he says these men, is he referring to the group of Jews who are trying to placate, or is he referring specifically to Gaius and Aristarchus from earlier on in the passage?
I think he'd know it was Gaius.
Yeah,
I think he'd know.
well, most interpretations, including my own, would line up that he's talking about those two, that they're not robbers of temples nor blasphemers of our goddess, which is an interesting.
Well, he's brought them back down to rational thinking. You know, look,
Yeah.
just work out the basics. These guys aren't doing either of these two things, which you should be angry about.
Yes, correct. They're not plundering the temple. They're not attacking things. They're not burning things to the ground. They're not riotous, unlike you. And so he's reaffirming their basic beliefs, erroneous as they were. Calling them undeniable facts makes sense for him. Paul would have something different to say about that, but that's a different question altogether. But again, as far as if that, again, and by the way, my point about the meteorite, that's not like some obvious historical fact. That's an inference that scholars have made about that. Okay, just so I'm clear on that. Okay. It's not like we have a parchment or a document that says exactly spelling out how the statue was made. But that's the inference that's made that it was potentially from a meteorite. And hence the image falling from the heavens. It's not the first time that, again, that was something, the movement, well, for all ancient, I've explained this plenty of times before in sermons, for example, the movement of the heavens, right, the sun, the stars and the planets and such, has always been a massive, massive, massive part of culture, of every culture ever across the world, including today. The movement of planets and the movement of stars and everything else marks times and seasons and the years and for navigation and everything else and all those kinds of things. And then certain kind of astronomical phenomena like a meteor shower has always served as a sign from the gods and other such things like that.
Omens
right?
and portents.
Yeah, exactly. Omens and portents. Yes, exactly. I mean, the entire way, I've explained this in our church history class when we covered all the way at the beginning. But the rise of the Roman Imperium, the rise of the Caesars, is very much tied to that. When Julius Caesar is assassinated in the Roman Senate in in 44 BC. A couple of months later, when they're having his funeral and great festival in his honour, on that very day, there's a meteor shower that passes over Rome, and this is taken as a sign that Caesar has ascended to the gods, right? And so then he's declared Divi to be divine. He's declared to have ascended into the Roman pantheon. He's now a god, and so then his adopted son Augustus, who becomes the first emperor, is then declared to be Divi Filius, the Son of God. And that's where the whole imperial cult is built, because a meteor shower happened.
Well, it's even happened in recent times. I think there was some meeting at Hitler's mountain retreat before he became Chancellor of his inner circle, and there was this really unusual storm where the sky was particularly bizarre, and they took that as a portent that Hitler would rise up to being ruling Germany.
Yeah. They did. Yeah. People have had those kinds of, and so there's the balance. It's not because, and so we tend to, in our modern Western society, take a very atheistic, materialistic view of these things, that they're just simply, that there's nothing at all going on. It's just simply planetary movements and a bunch of boring astronomical stuff. The balance is not falling into superstition, but also not falling into just atheist materialism, but actually that. No, again, how did the Babylonian magicians know that Christ was born? They followed a what? A star. Okay.
What we
Right.
think might be a supernova, but
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. There's the balance, right? The balance between unthinking atheistic material assumptions about the world, and then the flip side or the other end of the spectrum, which is becoming enslaved to superstition and omens and the whole box and dice, right? There's a balance, I would argue. But, and so he reminds me of this.
I wonder if it's possible that this meteorite that they said was the image fell down as is.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, well, yeah, okay. I know.
Because there's
Yeah,
no
yeah,
way
yeah.
they could carve. They wouldn't have had the tools to do it.
Well, that's where the whole concept of the image becomes interesting. It ties into it's interpretations, scholarly interpretations of certain archaeological data. How the image was portrayed on coins, for example, in Ephesus, that ties into it, etc., etc., etc. It's an interesting point, but what we can at least tell is that was their fundamental belief about it. Yeah. That much is obvious. The literalities of how it got how that happened kind of are a different historical or archaeological discussion. But yeah, no, good point. So verse 38, and so then if Demetrius, and he's still speaking here, the city clerk. So then, if Demetrius and the craftsmen who are with him have a complaint against anyone, the courts are in session and the proconsuls are available, so the Roman authorities. Let them bring charges against one another there.
That's so switched on. I mean, he knew who was instigating this.
Yeah.
He knew what the issue was behind this.
Correct. And he's an Ephesian too, so he's a Greek, and he's saying the courts are in session.
Yeah.
The Roman
So it's saying it's got to be done through the right way.
He's bringing them. He's trying to bring them back down to some semblance of level-headedness, and trying to restore order. This is a city official trying to restore order, basically. Yeah. Let them bring charges against one another there. Verse 39. But if you want anything beyond this, it shall be settled in a lawful meeting, right? In the lawful meeting, in the regular meeting. Again, he's trying to bring order to this chaotic, riotous setting.
He's already found out the background of this before he's even stood up to talk. So.
Well, yeah, it has been hours too, keep in mind, because Luke highlights that they were chanting and stuff for 2 hours.
So he had time.
Yeah, well, he had plenty of time, I suppose. Yeah, correct. So settling lawful meeting, verse 40, and this is the ending. For indeed we are in danger of being accused of a riot in connection with today's events, since there is no cause for which we can give as an account for this disorderly gathering. After saying this, he dismissed the meeting. So here's kind of the big picture points. The work, what this really is really in total, this is, and I think this is a really good reason for why Luke goes into this, especially in this kind of more elongated detail. This is the very essence of Christ's words that a house divided against itself cannot stand. Okay, Mark 3, Matthew, I think around chapter 13 maybe. I'd need to go back and have a look, but certainly Mark 3 is where I remember it being recounted. The Jewish authorities in Jerusalem, in the Gospels, obviously decades prior to this, accused Jesus of being evil, doing all this work by evil powers, and they accuse him of being possessed by demons and blah, blah, a whole bunch of
agent of the
stuff.
devil. Yep.
Yeah, an agent of evil and such, an evil of the devil. Yep, exactly. And he basically says back to them, can Satan cast out Satan? Can a house divided against itself stand?
Can a robber steal from a house without first tying up?
Yeah, exactly. In order to you must first bind the strong man, and then you can plunder his house. The strong man in this case he's referring to the devil. His house, in other words, the pagan nations, the kingdoms of the world. And he's basically telling him, I will bind the strong man, and then I will plunder his house, which is what he's been doing for 2,000 years and counting. Europe, which was part of that house, is now not his. Much of the Mediterranean world, and the Middle East, and other such places, and everywhere that Christendom has spread.
This is why people who say, there's devil under every bed, or there's Satan, there's rule, there's winning. Blah. I go, you just haven't seen what Jesus has said about that.
Yeah, it's as imbalanced as thinking that the devil doesn't exist. Again, stay on the horse. Don't fall off one side or the other of it. Is that this is an example of him actually, and by this him I mean Christ, I mean God. This is him actually causing chaos among his enemies. Where now that you've got the Greeks and the apostate Jews and the Roman authorities, and they're all at each other's throats. And meanwhile, Paul and the Christians are just fine.
I wonder if the Roman soldiers,
Totally
if the Roman soldiers are saying to each other, is this against Rome? No? Okay, we'll let it go then.
Yeah, there would have been there's a whole thing going on here, exactly. And again, the city clerk or the city mayor is a local magistrate. He would have been put in his position by Rome, but he's not a Latin, he's not a Roman in the literal sense. So that's why he says, we're in danger of being accused of a riot in today's connections by who? Well, the higher authorities of Rome, right? And so this is the house divided against itself. This is God's enemies falling into chaos among themselves while the gospel just keeps marching on. You know what I mean? And so this is God throwing his enemies into disarray.
This would have spread right throughout Asia too, one of
certainly
the big cities, and the whole city was
the news of it at the minimum, yeah. Let alone anything else, other consequences, yeah, absolutely, for sure. Yeah, and so Napoleon, who's one of the greatest military tacticians of all time, is famous for many sayings. One of which is, never interrupt your enemy while they're making a mistake.
Yeah, I've heard that one. Yeah, it's a good one.
I read that recently. When did I read that recently?
It's quoted many times.
Yeah, it's one of his.
Like this last week I read that.
Fair enough. Never interrupt your enemy while they're making a mistake. And this is an example of that. Gaius and Aristarchus are kind of in the thick of it to a degree, but they come out just fine, and they're not even really the focus. They get mentioned in verse 29, and there's really nothing ever that happens to them. We assume that they're probably tied up and just have been brought onto the stage or into the middle of the theatre, but nothing's happening. Nothing's happening to them. Nothing bad actually comes upon them. Paul and the other Christians don't get hauled out of their houses and other such. They're all fine. The only group here in the entire city of Ephesus that comes out of this unscathed is the Christians.
It's interesting that he actually says, we could be accused of rioting here, and the Romans aren't going to be happy. Let's not do this again, hey? Yeah,
let's not do it again. Exactly. And so, but this whole division is entirely a division among the enemies of Christ, and the ones who come out of it fine are the ones who are following him. This is like I point to plenty of examples, but when the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar II is driven into insanity by God, and is found out living among the animals and other such things from his insanity, that's a house divided against itself, and the chaos that comes from that in Babylon, right? Is that those who try to sow evil and chaos will then reap evil and chaos, but then they will often but then don't be surprised if you find that being reaped back onto yourself, right? When you do duplicitous works and unrighteous things, don't be surprised when the consequences come back upon you unintended. And so there's many things that we learn from here, but point being is that Luke's inclusion of this, and just simply finishing on, after saying this, he dismissed the meeting, really the whole point of all this being shown is to show how those who are working against Christ are not actually winning. The entire campaign against the Christians here has taken a significant knock against itself, not in favour of itself, and so that's really one of the fundamental reasons for Luke's inclusion of this riot that occurred here in the first century. The Christians are basically the only group that comes out unaffected by it all, and so that's where we end. Does anyone have any questions?
Just that when you mentioned Nebuchadnezzar, I thought that's why they named that ship that in the Matrix.
Yeah. Yes. Correct. Yeah.
The bringer of confusion.
The bringer of confusion and everything else. Yeah. Correct. Good point. So here's what we're going to do. that nice and neatly ends that chapter for us, which has been all throughout Ephesus. The next chapter, chapter 20, then moves on as Paul continues around the Eastern Mediterranean. In order to create a nice kind of clean break, and to give us a bit of a break, this today will be the last Bible study for this year. Okay.
It is getting to the busy time of the year, though,
Yes.
when the silliness happens.
So I've done the same thing with church history. So church history, we got up to a point where we got into a nice, just before we start on the church councils in the 4th and 5th centuries. So what that means is we'll take a break through Advent and Christmas into the new year. I'll look over there in a second as to what the specific date is in January.
Okay.
But it's around mid-January. But yes, that essentially ends our study.